Welcome to Being Curious podcast show, proudly supported by Moss Skin, a UK-based skincare line infused with sea moss. Good morning, Dave. Well, Dave Chambers, thank you for agreeing to be on my podcast, Being Curious with Counselling Reflections. I really am looking forward to our discussion. I know that you've done a lot and you've got a lot to give, but please tell the audience, tell our viewers, and tell our listeners a bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. I've listened to a couple of your podcasts and they're amazing. So I feel really privileged being a part of your venture, and so thanks for inviting me. As you said, my name is Dave Chambers. I'm a person-centered therapist, and I specialise in working with male clients. So about maybe 70% of my caseload are male clients, and that's unusual in the counselling field.
Yeah. Dave, thank you for the intro. Please tell us, what is person-centered therapy from your point of view? And wow, to have 70% of men, that is amazing. So a bit more of that as well.
So person-centered therapy is a field, modality in therapy. There's a number of different modalities. And in my field, person-centered therapists have a belief that clients are the experts in their life. So we help them to discover themselves. And we believe that by providing a safe environment, a nurturing environment where it's non-judgmental, where we offer support and unconditional regard, where we are honest and congruent or honest with our feedback, in that environment, people can grow and can explore themselves. So it's about offering a safe environment for people to explore themselves, where they know they're not going to be judged, so they know they're not going to be criticised. And in that environment, it's very powerful, actually. It's quite a subtle form of therapy, but very, very powerful.
Why person-centered? Because there's over 500 different therapeutic models. What was it about that? Of all the models you could have gone for in terms of training, why person-centered? What was the journey that got you there?
So, why person-centered? Let me talk to you about my journey to therapy maybe first, and then person-centered, because I think it all sort of ties in. So I didn't start, as a kid, I didn't have a thought that I wanted to be a therapist. I sort of fell into it. My parents were in helping professions. My mum was a nurse. My dad was a social worker. And I remember them, sitting around the table talking about helping people. So I sort of had a germ of an idea that, this sounds like really interesting. This is an interesting thing to get into. I went to university. On my sort of summer holidays, my dad was able to get me some working in children's homes. That's how I started working with people. He at that time was an assistant director of Birmingham Social Services, so he was able to pull some strings. And so I was able to get used to working with people in a helping environment. That's my first job.
It must have been really unusual, because I can't imagine when you first started and on your journey, were there many men and were there many black men doing that profession? And then really unusual that your dad is so senior in social services, because what would that have been, 80s and 90s?
It would have been. Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, it would have been. Well, I would have been at university in the early 1980s. So, and at that point, he was the assistant director. Eventually, he went on to become the director of the social services in London Borough. So, that was good in terms of having a role model, a male, positive black role model in terms of building a career. So that led me to believe that actually as black men we can do anything really. So that was a really important thing to learn.
Wow.
But also,
so black men, It's lovely.
And then, as you say, there weren't too many men actually working in, certainly not black men, working in children's homes. And so that was something I had to negotiate, negotiate, and navigate. And then from there, I worked in a secure unit for 2 or 3 years, and again, that was an eye-opener. And I noticed there were very few black staff, but lots of black clients. That was interesting. And lots of black boys
Really?
in the secure unit.
Wow.
Very few girls, mainly boys, and a disproportionate amount of black boys. So that again was an interesting.
What did you think about that? That where you was working, not only you're a black male member of staff, but you're also kind of working in environments where it's overpopulated by other black young people. What happened? What went through your mind during that time?
From learning from my dad, actually, he was really clued in, and we had a good education, me and my brother and sister, about how racism works in this country. So I had an understanding. It was about policing. It was about the neighbourhoods that we socioeconomic class and the neighbourhoods that we grew up in and the difficulties. It was about the education system and the kids being expelled from school. So I kind of had quite a good understanding of why black kids ended up, I guess, in the criminal justice system, because the secure unit is, it's the criminal justice system. So, by the time I was working...
And you wouldn't be... In your training, sorry to cut you, you're making me feel very excited. But in your training, would you have had training around these issues, around these kind of social economic issues that I suppose ethnic minorities or majority groups would have had when you was kind of training and being trained?
Well, you say when I was being trained, I've been trained in 2 professions. So I was trained as a social worker in the mid-90s, and then I've also been trained as a therapist. I've been to university, I've got 2 masters, one in a master's in social work and a master's in counselling psychotherapy. And training as a social worker, there was a little bit, but not enough. It felt like a tokenistic kind of thing, really. There wasn't a lot of training around ethnicity and diversity, and certainly as a therapist, there was even less, which is really quite shocking, isn't it, really? We had one...
Really? So in both professions, you didn't have much kind of training around ethnicity?
No, we didn't.
So what led you on to, I suppose, your second, becoming a therapist? What was it about social work practice that may have not been enough for you, or did you just evolve in your practice? And
I think I trained as a social worker, and when you train as a social worker, you have 2 options. You can either become a social worker, or if you take a criminal justice take a criminal justice modules, you can become a probation officer. So I actually left university, became a probation officer, working in social services though as a youth justice social worker. And so my interest was in just working with, within the criminal justice system, working with young people and trying to divert them away from the courts and divert them away from the prison system. So I had some interesting jobs.
What was it like to be in that space? Yeah, I can imagine. What was it like to be in that space at that time? Because I think it's probably a unique time to kind of work in that field. And you talked about earlier where you saw, you worked with younger black men going through the system. You recognized that in part that it was down to racism and social economic class and all those intersectionalities that affect families in the UK. What was it about that work that kind of drew you in, or what did you notice about that work that informed your practice?
I enjoyed the work. Back then, the way probation was structured was a little bit like doctors working in a doctor's surgery. Say you would have your own office, you'd have a relatively small caseload of 30 people. They would come and see you once a week or once every fortnight, and it was kind of a holistic approach. So you would help them to try and find employment, you'd help them to try and find a job, you'd help them with housing, link them in with maybe mental health services. So there's a sense that you had a relatively small number of people to work with, and you were there to help them. So there's a real sense of, you know, connecting with people, building rapport, and helping people to just get on with life and to find a way out of crime, out of offending. It's very rewarding. But over the years, the probation service changed. Unfortunately, like in education and other services, the government got involved and they've got this view that they know better rather than speaking to the professionals, and they completely revamped the whole system, the whole service. So we went from working in individual offices to working in these big, huge offices with maybe a few waiting rooms where we shared clients, so we didn't have our own clients. Clients would just come in and see a probation officer that was available at the time. So you lost that connection with individuals, and it became a very different service. So I grew out of love probation. I was in love with it when I started. But I think I was in probation for about 15 years. You know, and during that time,
it sounds like the early. Sorry for cutting you. It sounds like the early part of your career was person-centered. It was relational. It was kind of a relationship. You know, small caseload of 30, seeing them weekly, seeing them fortnightly. It felt like you was doing really good work then. And then consecutive governments, because I assume if we're talking about the 90s, we'd have had quite a few governments have decided actually it wasn't working then. And so you fell out of love. What was introduced then? What was the difference between the beginning and the end of probation work?
In the beginning,
in terms of loving it.
In the beginning, as I say, it was about connection, probation officers having a connection with the people they were working with. And in the end, it was more of the probation officer being the case manager, not necessarily doing the face-to-face work, but sort of organising for other people to do the work. So I would have assistant probation officers doing the face-to-face work with the clients. I would be managing the assistant probation officer, I'd be managing, or the probation service officer would be called up, I'd be managing the mental health. So I was like, they called it a hub approach. You were in the middle of the wheel, and you had all these spokes leading out, different people doing the work. So I wasn't doing the work. And what really interests me in working with people is working with people. It's not managing, it's not doing the admin, it's actually, as you say, the person.
Was you more doing the administrative coordinating of the work and not really getting involved in the work? Whereas your strength, I assume, then was that you connect really well with the people that you were working with.
I think that's very fair. I mean, halfway through my working in probation service, I spent 5 years working in a prison. And I know you've worked in a prison. And
I have.
Now, working in a prison, you are immersed with your clients. It's like you're living with your clients. So if you don't like the idea of working at the coalface with anything that can come up and being responsive to people, and you're going to struggle, working in a prison. I loved it. I loved the face-to-face. I loved the jeopardy. I loved the spontaneity. So I had an office actually on a wing. I think there was 80 inmates in my wing. And I just loved the whole culture. And it's a very fascinating environment to work in. You see the male posturing and how they conduct each other, how they conduct themselves, on the wing. But then they knock on my door they had access. I had an open door policy. If there was anything causing them concern, they could knock on my door. And as soon as the door would shut, they'd break down in tears and, talk about the problems they were experiencing in the prison or the people they were missing in the community. But then as soon as we finished speaking, they were back in the wing, posturing, being tough and, making
Yes.
bother them.
All right, absolutely. I'm smiling. I'm smiling and recognising the experience that you've had. I absolutely loved working in the prison, and I was on the education side. So I suppose I saw a range of men because I covered a range of subjects whilst I was there. But I recognised that, that people had different personalities, that actually when it was one-to-one or smaller groups, men could be vulnerable. But if I went on the wing, it'd be like, oh, I miss, and it would be kind of difficult. What made you start to think about going into a career of counselling? What was it about I assume men's prison that you worked at, did you? And you predominantly worked with men?
A male private prison, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. What was it about that experience that led you into the work and thinking about men in the way that you do?
Well, my dissertation, actually, for my probation or social work qualification, I studied masculinity and offending and why it was that some men, why is it that men are more likely to commit offences than women? And I explored whether some offences are committed by mainly men. Are men sort of predisposed to certain types of offences? So that was a fascinating study, which really informed my practice throughout probation and beyond.
What did you find out? Was anything a shock? What should we know?
What should you know?
As professionals? What should we know? What did you find out in terms of your research?
I mean, we're going back going back to the 1990s, aren't we? So it's a lot, and I can't remember everything, but the big takeaways was that men often offend as a rite of passage, as a way of proving their manhood and a way of proving that they're no longer boys. So that's a part of it. So I studied things like joyriding, which is a very unusual term, is it? Joyriding. It's death riding, it should probably be called, or something more suitable because it's not joy. But there's something about.
I don't know if I've heard much about it. Is it still about? I don't know, because that was a big thing, wasn't it, in the 90s? And
yes, it was.
Joyriding.
I don't know whether I don't know now because it's been many years since I was in probation, but I don't know whether it's still the same. I don't know if car theft is the same as it was in the 90s. It was a major problem in the 90s. It may be different now. It might be associated with drugs and ordering cars on delivery and all that. It wasn't in the 90s. In the 90s, it was about stealing fast cars and showing it off right to your mates on the house on the council estate. It was more about.
And you saying it was men at that time, it was like a rites of passage, that it was a coming of age.
Yes.
I wonder if it's things like, like rockabillys and teddy boys back in the 50s, 60s, where they used to have a ruckus and, and it was a kind of rites of passage there.
I think
why prison though?
That's it. That's it. It's about showing off to your
mates.
Finding fast cars and showing them off to your mates. And you're not having the car, permanently. It's just for a night or just for a weekend. That's what it was.
Yeah. So did you see particular ethnic groups in prison at that time? If there was a disproportionate amount of young black lads and men in prison, and yet the population in this country is less than 5%, were they joyriding or were they in for different offences? Different groups had different offences?
Yes, there was a disproportionate amount of black youth in the prison that I was working at. A lot of those, so we talk about Manchester during the mid-90s. Manchester had, that time, had a particularly bad gang culture. We had 4 or 5
Really?
major gangs that the police were trying to infiltrate and break up. And so a lot of the people in the prison that I was working in were affiliated to various gangs. We're talking the type of offences, we're talking about drugs, we're talking about robberies, serious robberies, burglaries. So that was slightly different. You know, when I was working in the prison, the offences were, we talk about very serious murders. I had one client, for example, who had attempted to shoot 3 police officers, and it just so happened that his submachine gun jammed, so he didn't kill them.
Wow.
But he ended up, he was in prison when I was working with him. He was serving a 10-year stretch. So we're talking about, you know,
Wow.
we're talking about not everybody.
Very serious crimes.
But some of them were
Very serious crimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I suppose then working in a system where there's some really kind of serious social issues, the police have to police it, and probation had to kind of do the work around it after the sentencing. What did you also pick up? You know, what did you also notice about during that time? What started the journey towards therapy, do you think? And becoming a therapist?
I think the experience of having an office on the wing and talking to people in desperate need, they really, all they wanted to do was just talk for an hour to somebody about their experience, their fears, their concerns, their struggles, their distress, their anxiety. That really gave me an insight into therapy. Although I wasn't trained as a therapist, what I was actually providing, the service I was was therapy. I didn't, at the time, I didn't know that. So I was doing my probation job, but actually, on reflection, the service I was providing was therapy. I was providing a safe environment for people to be able to talk. And that's all they needed, you know, to work through their...
It's really interesting listening to you, because I agree with that. I think there was something about working in spaces where men are vulnerable, and we have a disproportion of care leavers in prison. We have a disproportion of men who come out of the army in prison. We have a disproportion of men who have learning or neurodiversity in terms of dyslexia, dyspraxia, you know, all the ACEs, adverse childhood experience. We have these kind of men in those spaces. So I can imagine how powerful that must be to have someone like yourself as a male showing positive regard and compassion and kindness and acceptance of where the men are at that point.
Absolutely. And I learned how powerful listening is. I don't think I'd learned it until I worked in the prison. I didn't realise how powerful it is. If you can find a space for somebody, a safe space where people can talk and express themselves and work through their vulnerabilities, and somebody that's going to listen without judging them, it's very, very powerful. And I could see the difference I was making. Actually, there are very few people in a prison setting that are geared up to help people in that way. The teachers are, maybe, and the probation services and the chaplain. But other than that, everyone else has got a job to do, which is about, you know, sort of rehabilitating offenders.
What I found really interesting at the time when I was working in a prison was that I think how overstretched some of the staff were there. And I think I began, like you, just to kind of want to have a different conversation with men.
Yeah, that's it.
And show men. And I thought it was through education initially. And I think there's something what you said about kind of listening to their stories, because some of those stories are very difficult stories to listen to.
Yeah.
And how did you carry on with the work that you needed to do on behalf of society?
Yeah, there's something about separating that out. So as a probation officer, you've got some core tasks, preparing people for release, maybe preparing parole reports, sitting in on self-harm boards. There's a number of jobs that you have. But then I also had space to do, the other, the caring, pastoral stuff as well. And it's a question of just being professional, doing the other bits to the best of your ability, but also making it known really to everybody that you care about, essentially you care. And you will find time for, I would find time for people, if they wanted to speak to me, they could just knock on my door and I would find the time. I'd figure out a way of being able to see them. I think that's really important.
Moving on to how you got into therapy. How did you get into therapy? What was it about the course that you chose and the way that you wanted to work with men that kind of led you? And I know you've had lots of other kind of careers, but how did you get to becoming a therapist?
Well, you're right. I had other careers. So what happened once I had left the probation service, I went into the private sector for a number of years. And I wasn't sure I was going to come back into working with people. But then over time, I realised that it was something I missed. I missed the face-to-face client work. And so my way back was actually, I worked at the Samaritans. I did some volunteer work at the Samaritans.
Did you?
For a couple of years. And that really did whet my appetite, just getting back into working with people and listening to people's stories. There's something really fascinating, isn't there, as you've said, about listening people's stories and just being there for them and trying to guide them through difficult times in their lives. And that was it. After I'd got this job working in Samaritans, I applied to go on a course, on a person-centered course. And why person-centered? Because I'd looked at person-centered and CBT. Person-centered was more, that resonated with me. That was more really what I had been doing.
How did the Samaritans work equip you for your course? Because are they the same thing? Because it's a very different model. My supervisor that I had for many years, he came through the Samaritans as well. What was it about the Samaritans work that helped you to kind of be ready for your course?
Listening. Pure and simply, just the art of listening, the art of active listening. I mean, you do get some basic training to become a Samaritan. It's not as in-depth as counselling training, but it's a start. And it's the practice of really hearing people, allowing people to know that you're hearing them, and connecting with people in a therapeutic space. It was getting back into that I realised that actually I want to do this as a full-time job. Samaritans, you do maybe 2 or 3 shifts. I can't remember, was it maybe 2 or 3 shifts a week? And I wanted to work with people again full-time. And I knew that by training.
And so how did your course get you ready to kind of train? Because it's a baptism of fire, isn't it? Doing a counselling course, whatever modality you do, it is life-changing. How did you cope with the first year of training, or just the training in itself?
I think the training is in 2 bits. There's and I thought get back into academia would be tough. So there's the academic bit, and then there's a bit about where you work on yourself, which I completely underestimated. I thought that'd be adorable. I think I'm fairly well sorted. I've done a lot of stuff. I've done my social work training. I should be okay. Well, let me tell you something. That was the hardest bit, actually. The reflective
Really?
stuff.
What was it about it?
That was the journey
part.
Yeah, the journey.
The work on yourself.
Yeah, that's a real journey. I thought I was sorted. I thought I understood myself. I thought I had addressed, myself. And as part of the training, all counsellors have to have their own therapy. So I had 20 weeks of therapy. We had a personal development group once a week where we'd talk about our own issues. And I realised that there were lots of issues that I had locked away in a box and I hadn't really addressed from childhood all the way through. And unpicking that and working through my own issues, my own vulnerabilities, being able to, as a man, don't forget, although I'm a therapist, I've been socialised to be a man in terms of locking emotions away and not necessarily expressing vulnerabilities. All that I came to the course with, and I had to learn actually to be vulnerable. I had to learn to express my emotions. I had to learn to be comfortable with discomfort. I had to learn not to have a need to be in control. All the traps of masculinity I had to kind of unpick. And I think possibly for men on those courses, it may be more, I think it is actually, as a man speaking, more tricky getting through a counselling course.
I was going to ask you about that. I'm listening to you and I'm really aware that there wasn't many men when I was training. So I can't imagine if there was many men on your course. And the idea of having to be vulnerable, you know, in a way that maybe the course doesn't take into account men's masculinity or men's needs, because it's probably a very female, Western, European, doesn't really take on board other people's cultures other than possibly mindfulness within the East. I don't think maybe in your training did you kind of have those ideas. So just to think about being a man, a black man on the
And
course.
I think the way you frame that,
be quite...
yeah, I think you framed that exactly right, because it's not just about being a man, it's being a black man. So there's two issues that I had to work through. First of all, being a man and working through, as I say, being vulnerable, allowing myself, learning how to be vulnerable, and as I just said. And then there's something about, you know, it was a Eurocentric course, it was a white course, there were very few black people on my course. And something about being vulnerable as a black person in a white space as well, which was tricky. You know, the messages I got from growing up is, you know, don't sort of air your dirty laundry in public, certainly not to white people. You know, you keep that away. You don't show weakness. You don't, you know, let people, white people, because they're going to judge you. If you tell them too much, they're going to judge you. That was the message I grew up with. So I had to unpick all of that, and that was not easy.
It sounds. I understand that referencing. You know, don't air your dirty laundry out in public, and then also when you're an outside group, a minority group, and you're against a majority group, there are things that we really know a lot about because we're experiencing the wider society's influence on us. But also we have influence from, whether it's Caribbean or African or whether it's Southern Asian, influences about what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman from our own cultures as well. So I can imagine that must have been really challenging in a positive and negative way.
I have to say it was challenging, unfortunately, in a negative way. I have to say,
Really?
we think when you that the counselling profession would be a profession that understands diversity, it would be a profession that is culturally competent. And although there are counsellors that are culturally competent, and as an organisation, I think there's a lot of work for us to do. I'll give you an example. So we just had, when it comes to race, we just had one workshop one day. It wasn't weaved into the course. In an ideal world, it would be weaved into lots of the lectures and lots of the course, but it wasn't. It was just this sort of one standalone day. And unfortunately, one of the facilitators was clearly not up to scratch. I remember one of my peer group mentioned stereotyping. That's, you know, I think she said something like stereotyping is really quite useful because it gives you a handle on what people might be like. And I challenged that. I said, well,
sorry, I just got to hear that.
Yeah.
Stereotype is quite useful because it helps you to understand what people may be like. Yeah. How did you take that? Because I was in my head, defensive.
Well, In your head, what?
In my head, I want to be defensive, but how does that work? How did you hear that?
I heard it as I was angry actually, so I was annoyed, and I had to challenge. I thought I can't let that stand. But one of maybe 4 or 5 people of colour, and this was in a big group. There was about 40 of us in the group, and I thought, these are the future. You've got to make sure that they have some real understanding of what diversity is and the impact of racism is going to be on the lives of their clients. And so I challenged. I said, that's not my experience as somebody of colour. My experience is that stereotyping has never been a good thing for me. People have made assumptions about me as a black man, and they're never positive. They're always negative, and it's difficult to work through those stereotypes. Somebody else made a comment, and then the facilitator then went on to say, well, but there's often a grain of truth in some of those stereotypes. And again, it was like, I just said that. And again, it's very tricky, isn't it? In a group setting, and I just said something like, "But who's making the decision about the grain of salt, grain of sand?" It's not the black. We haven't got a decision as to how we're stereotyped. It's white people or people in power that are stereotyping us, and they just got it wrong, really. If you're going to have a workshop,
it's interesting, isn't it? Because counselling and the training of counselling is such a beautiful craft. It's such a beautiful thing to experience.
Yeah.
But like everything else out there, we still have a lot to learn and we still have a lot to grow. But there is an expectation that organisations who are taking on the task of dealing with people's mental health, there should be things that they think about automatically and weave into. But at the time of your training, that wasn't so. Do you think what else do you think they could have done, or what else was you worried about for you in terms of your own experience as a black man during that time and during that training?
Really, that I didn't have too many concerns other than navigating my colour, my ethnicity, and navigating being a man within the counselling profession. Those two were quite.
Well, what about masculinity, being a man, and the way that the counselling is often framed, and where maybe female counsellors like myself may not take into account men's needs?
So that's a great question. So I kind of, as the course developed, I became, and bearing in mind my previous research when I was doing my probation, I kind of started to think about how gender plays into, how we work with clients. And I think I did an essay on masculinity and therapy as I was preparing for my dissertation, because my dissertation was looking at the connection, why. But the question I asked myself is that why is it that only 30% of counselling clients are men? Why are men not coming through the door? What's preventing men from seeking and utilising therapy? And on the training, we do a placement, and I was aware on placement that we had very few male clients. I was also aware, which is interesting, that the male clients that we had, they tended to be no-shows for the first session. So they would fail initial session more than women, which is interesting. Yeah. And there were less men coming through the door. So all that was, I was curious.
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? There's less men. So less than 30% of men are not coming into counselling at that time. And then the first session is no shows.
Yeah.
How did you frame that? What was your hypothesis around that? Why don't men come to counselling? Because I have a theory, but and why do they not come to the first session as well?
Okay, let me talk to you about my findings, my study and my findings. So I did a literature review asking myself that question, why is it that men aren't coming to therapy? And from the review, I was able to find out that there are 5 main reasons why men struggle to utilize therapy in the same way that women do. And this is bearing in mind, bear in mind that 3/4 of suicides are men, when you bear in mind that 96 or 97% of the prison population is men, and when you bear in mind that I think it's 85% of rough sleepers are men, clearly men have problems, and yet they're not seeking help. So it's a really interesting conundrum. That, clearly men are in crisis, men are experiencing problems, but they're not coming forward. So that's the premise of my research. Why are they not coming forward? If anything, you would expect more men to come to therapy than women. Because those stats would suggest that.
And so when you think about the suicide rates, when you think about rough sleeping, when you think about kind of mental health in overall, men have these in greater numbers. And that's the sad thing, because suicide rates was on a decline, but post-COVID, suicide rates have started to creep up again. And that where you kind of see Scotland and you see Ireland, Northern Ireland, you saw a higher rate. In the UK, men are really struggling. What was your hypothesis? What did you find out through your research as to why? How did you answer that question?
So by synthesizing all the data, I was able to find there are 5 main reasons why men don't come to therapy in the same ways as women. So the first one is around stigma. So stigma is, the view that I'm socially unacceptable, so it affects your sense of self-worth. And men experience embarrassment and shame or stigma in a different way to the way that women experience stigma. So there's public stigma. There's 2 types of stigma. There's public stigma, which is how the public views certain things like maybe mental health, the general discourse around mental health and the stigmatization by the public. And what men do is we penalize ourselves even more. So however disparaging the public may think about certain groups in society, what men will do is we will disparage ourselves even more. And stigma is actually the major reason why men are more likely to take their lives, because we stigmatize ourselves much more than women do. So I don't know if that makes sense.
And yet this information is such an important piece of information for everyone to know. And I don't think, even in my own training, and I've trained in lots of different things, but in my own training, I don't think we, as a profession, talk about stigma.
No.
And yet, men are struggling. We do know that men struggle and don't tend to have the support in the same way that women do. But this whole idea, is it different? Is stigma different from shame in your view? Are they the same thing?
Yeah, it's very similar, but it's a sense that I am socially unacceptable. So, for example,
I am socially unaccepted.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example, if a woman loses a job and if a man loses a job, as an example, first of all, let me talk about some men, because it's not all men we're talking about, it's just some men. Some men experience that as unmanly. And that's, as a man, I should have a job. I should be able to take care of my family. And the fact that I haven't got a job, effectively they stigmatize themselves. And that's a thing that can lead to either self-harm or drug use or alcohol use, other ways of dealing with that discomfort. Whereas women, again, we talk about some women that won't necessarily process that in the same way.
Yeah. So you got 4. So we've done 1. What are the other 4?
The other one is something called gender role conflict. So men experience
gender role conflict.
Yeah, which is an interesting term. And this is the dissatisfaction that some men can experience in trying to conform to traditional notions of masculinity. There's a lot there. So does that make sense? I'll break that down. So men tend to have a set of like a playbook of what it is to be a man, a set of traits that define me as a man. So, for example, as a man, I shouldn't show emotion. I should be powerful. I should be successful. I should be competent. Maybe some men might have the notion that you should be promiscuous. There's a set of traits that a lot of young boys aspire to.
It feels like scripts, isn't it? It feels like
script.
It feels like script, doesn't it? That's either intergenerationally passed down through the family or society's input onto what they perceive men to be, and it's like a blueprint that if you don't match it, you're not successful.
You're not a man. If you don't match it, you're not a man, and that's and you get penalised. You get penalised by other men for not reaching that bar. If you're not manly, other men will penalise you, bully you, put you down, or call you names if you're not perceived as being manly. So it is really powerful.
Wow,
it's very powerful.
Yeah,
and it starts in the playground. It starts with children. So in a playground, you might hear things like a boy saying to another boy, "You're throwing like a girl."
You're thrown like a girl. And when you think about where that comes from, that definitely comes from an adult or other places or society, because children wouldn't know that. So in terms of what are the other three? I'm really mindful of the time, so I need to make sure that we get all this kind of information in.
The other three are men can come to therapy with a preconceived notion of what therapy is. So they're less, if you like, open-minded compared to women, and more skeptical, actually. And of course, it's unmanly to need help. It's unmanly to not be in control. And of course, men can have the notion that coming to therapy is giving up control, giving up their masculinity. So there's something about having preconceived ideas about what therapy is, and therapy is not for men, therapy is for women.
It's interesting because I think men still get therapy, but in terms of Afro-Caribbean backgrounds and maybe thinking about other groups of people, it's not the therapist that they get that information from. It may be seeing men at the barbershop. There was some research or some ideas around training people who are barbers. And I'm wondering, is it about kind of they can be vulnerable in a different way with their peer group in the barbershop? Does that messaging still count? Or is it something different when you go to a professional in that clinical space that kind of makes men worry a bit more?
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I'm hearing it in relation to black men and barbershops. And although I didn't, there's something about, what did I find? I found there was a finding that black men do better in therapy. They're more likely to, once they come through the door, more likely to remain in therapy compared to their white counterparts. And that's around being more robust. The experience of being marginalised in society has made black men more robust, if you like, to white men, and therefore much able to combat stigma. We're going back to stigma. So black men feel less stigmatised, or able to combat the stigma that might prevent them from doing well in therapy because they're used to being marginalised in society.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a lot of kind of discussion lately around masculinity, and especially for working class white men, in terms of their own intersectionality against maybe middle class white men and access to resources. And I can understand if you're not used to getting the resources that you need, and that you see other groups around you succeeding or using those resources, you could feel left behind. And how can, I suppose, in that, how can other groups also make use of therapy? Because that's a real struggle for men if they're coming with all this intersectionality that's around them.
Therapy is available to anybody that wants to come through the door. It just so happens that.
Do you think so? Because a lot of people, why, if that's the case, then why would it still remain at 30%? And before it was even lower than that. So, you know, if it, yes, it is, and I know and you know it is, but what makes it difficult for men to kind of, for it to land? Is it the way that I, as a woman, as a female therapist, work with men?
As my study showed, it's the stigma that men experience. You know, it's the gender role conflict, the internal conflict that men are experiencing, the distress they're experiencing just being a man. The other, and it's preconceived ideas that they have with therapy. The other barrier, if you like, to men seeking and utilizing therapy is around the notion that they're going to have to talk about emotions. So some men really struggle. It's actually quite frightening for some men to talk about their emotions. Obviously, men are socialized not to speak about emotions, to be vulnerable. It's, again, antithetical to masculinity and manhood to be vulnerable. And so it's working with that. How do you help men to be vulnerable? And of course, it's a major barrier. Men, what we know in the mental health profession, for example, serious mental health, is that even if a man suspects they may be struggling with a mental health issue, they won't come forward for diagnosis because they will have to speak about lots of other things as well, but they'll have to speak about their emotions. And they'll have to
it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you said that, because I remember when I did some research myself in terms of what dissertation that I was writing about, and I often spent most of my, I think most of my training I've written about men. And what was interesting was the fact that actually when you think about men's issues, it's a societal issue, isn't it? It's not, if half of the population are not accessing spaces to be able to be vulnerable and talk. But it's also about women's own socialization around what we need from men if we're heterosexual. And we have a richer term of non-binary and much more fluid approach to masculinity. And yet for some men, the ability to be themselves, connect with their world, makes it really difficult.
I think the work I'm doing with the men, just quickly, so the last one is fear of femininity. You know, men are quite frightened with the perception that they could be seen as either feminine or gay. And that's another reason why men struggle to come to therapy. If I go to therapists and tell my mates, they're going to think I'm a woman, or they're going to think I'm gay. So it's, again, that's another barrier. In relation to what you were just saying there about, you know, sort of masculinity and how it shows up, I think the work I do with men is to give them permission to understand that there's multiple masculinities, lots of different ways to be a man. There's not just one way. You mentioned non-binary, you mentioned, you know, in terms of gender, there's lots of different ways for you to express your masculinity. You don't have to conform to the rule book or the playbook. In actual fact, emotions are emotions, they're human emotions. They're not, you know, there's not certain emotions that are for women and certain emotions that are for men. We experience the full range of emotions. And it's helping men to understand that it's okay to express the full range of emotions and express and be vulnerable. It's okay. And
also be angry if you want to, and not. It's really interesting. Why am I saying that? there is something about being a range of emotions. The anger is left out in that arrange sometimes. And I think it's really important to be able to be expressive and for men to talk in the way that they need to express. I am really privileged, I feel like, working with men. And I think at this time, because I definitely see more men in practice, whether they're Black, Asian, young men, older men. What are you seeing now that's different from the research that you did? Or are you seeing an evolution of ideas around masculinity now that you didn't before? Or have we gone backwards? Because we're now in a recession, so who knows what's going on in terms of resourcing for men and accessing the things that men need.
I think I'm using my research to inform my practice, and I think it sort of confirms what I learned from my from my studies. And in actual fact, I've used my studies to be able to build a male practice. I mean, the interesting thing is, bearing in mind that 30% of male clients are male, how is it that my caseload is inverted 70%? So I learned one of my recommendations in my research was the way we speak to men is really important to attract them. So on my website, the way I market, the way I'm selling the therapist story to men is male-centric. I'm speaking specifically and directly to men and entice them and saying, therapy is for you as well as for women. It's not just for women. So I'm sort of undoing some of those preconceived ideas that men may have. And then when men come, make a referral, I'm talking to them very gently about the therapy process. Again, men tend to have a fear of the unknown when it comes to therapy. So in the early session, in fact, before the early session, in my literature, my emails to men, I'm talking a little bit about, in therapy, I'm not going to do anything to you. We're just going to be talking, just try and make it easy for men to understand the process, because I think the process can seem quite daunting and scary when it really isn't. How many times have I said, we're just two people having a chat, both on the same level, sharing power. There's nothing fancy here. I'm not going to do anything to you that's going to feel weird.
Sorry to cut you. Do you think that's really important in the terms of a point of view from a male therapist to a male client? Because it's interesting, because I think people come to us for all sorts of reasons. And I look at trauma, and I think the younger clients need something from me that is often might not be present in life. I see a lot of white men and Southern Asian men, as well as older West African men. Funny enough, I don't really see many men from Caribbean backgrounds. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but it's a kind of range. But I often wonder, how can I connect with them in a way that will serve them the best, But I think there is something that I felt when I was working in the prison that I had an advantage being a female, but I think you have an advantage of being a male.
It may be that because I'm male, men are wanting to work with me. I haven't seen the research for that, but that's a possibility. But I also think it's about how we talk to men, how we communicate to men. For example, on my website, I never use the term mental health, because from my findings, I learned that there's certain words that are trigger words for men. And if men feel they're going to be psychoanalyzed, or if they're going to be assessed for mental health, that can be an affront to their manhood, a threat to their masculinity. So I think we just have to be very careful with the wording, very careful with the language, and maybe adopt a sort of a male, working with men, a male-centric way of working with them.
There's some research coming out in different spaces where younger men are more engaging, like they understand mental health and when I'm working with younger men, and I'm saying like 16, 17 years up, they have a language for their mental health, and some of it is about, I don't want to say that, if you come from a single parent home, and it's female run, that you can't raise men. But there is something about the importance of having male role models in men's life that they can lean into, who are emotionally competent. And I think some of my men who I've worked with in the past and currently don't often have that role model.
There's a lot in that. Of course, the the counselling service reflects our clients. So 70% of counsellors are female. So there aren't, as a percentage, there isn't, balance when it comes to male therapists and having male role models. And of course, women could do the work just as well as men. Just because you're female doesn't mean that you can't work with male clients. But I think it's just about having an awareness of men's gender. So one of the questions I ask, I will explore with men, which I think can get lost in our practice. I ask men how their gender shows up in their, what's it like being a man in today's society? What's it like being a man? It's a question that, from my research, is not asked. We never.
No, say that again, because I'm loving that. Say that again.
What's it like being a man in today's society? How does your masculinity show up? What's it like being a black man? Is it difficult being a man? What's it like being a man in your family? Simple questions. But it's just an exploration of their masculinity and what their masculinity means, and how the masculinity maybe could be a hindrance, maybe never been questioned, never been thought about. Is it causing is it distress? Is it causing distress? You having to conform to masculinity, does that cause you any discomfort?
I'm really mindful of the time, and I could talk to you all day. But I really want you to kind of, what do you want us to take away from today's conversation? What do you want potential clients to know? What do you want other therapists or other people working with men to kind of think about when they're going about their practice? And I know it's a big, I know, I've just offered them, that's a massive question. So I'm really mindful of that. But yeah.
I think it's just about, so within the last maybe 10 years or so, I think the counselling profession has done really well in recognising diversity. Counsellors now, we do have training, and we're much more aware. And in terms of our ethical framework and ethical code, there's an awareness of the importance of being culturally competent. And that includes, that's race and religion, etc. I would include gender in that quest for cultural competence, because I see masculinity in this case, not in any other case, because we live in a patriarchal world. But in this case, when you can bear in mind that only 30% of counselling clients are male, in this situation, men are a minority. And I think what I was saying in my thesis is that men should be considered, we should pay attention to men in terms of being culturally competent around gender. Just like we need to be culturally competent around race, we should also be culturally competent around gender, but we don't do any training really around gender as therapists. And I think it's really important to be mindful of how men's masculinity might be the main reason why they're struggling. Never considered.
Dave Chambers, where can people find you?
Our website, counsellingchambers.com, and they can find me there.
Thank you so much, Dave, for coming on Being Curious with Counselling Reflections. I'm coming away smiling. because it's really important. It's something that I really believe in terms of men's public health. And lots of questions are bubbling up in my brain that I need to kind of process. I really would like you to come back and talk a bit more, if you can, because I think there's lots of things we could discuss in relation to kind of men's health. And I really appreciate you are one voice in many voices out there, but yet a unique voice when thinking about not only men's health, but your own journey as a psychotherapist and what led you here in the first place. So thank you very much, Dave, for agreeing to being curious. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.